Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox Podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. All right, everybody, welcome to this very special Scrum Master Toolbox Podcast YouTube episode. Okay, the audio is also on the podcast feed, as you're probably listening to this on the podcast with along with all the other 8,000 people who usually download one of the episodes. But this is a very special episode. I have with me a friend, Ed, who's actually going to have some critical questions for us that many of you guys have probably asked yourselves or are being asked by your colleagues. So first, a quick intro. Ed is our marketing wizard here on Oikosofy and the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, and we're actually doing a project together, the 48-hour book method. Link is on the show notes and in the description if you guys want to check it out. But Ed, a quick intro to you. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I would like to see myself as a product manager of all the product ideas that I come across and all the products that we work together. And this is what I do most of the time, almost product manage everything from managing my life to teaching people certain aspects of, let's say, product and marketing. And that include authority building, basically. This is what our book is all about. And in that book, we are teaching how to use product management methodologies in managing your own, let's say, personal brand as a thought leader. So this is very rough of what I do.
Absolutely. And Ed's been working with us for a while. He's helped with launching some of our books and just recently helped also with the first serious Facebook ad campaign for the Agile Online Summit. So it's like this guy's a marketing wizard. But he had a question for us that has nothing to do with marketing. So let's start with that, Ed. Introduce that question for us. How did you come up with that question and why did you want to talk to me about it?
Well, why do I want to talk to you about it is obvious because I cannot think of any better person who I know or can reach out to who can answer this as an authority in this area. And having worked in Agile while working with you for 4.5 years, I thought that this would be a perfect time to dig in a little bit more details because my knowledge of Agile is very theoretical or a little bit far off, as I'm not an Agile practitioner, professional Agile practitioner, but I do work in product management. So it's one of the like I was going through certain job applications and I got some interest in from some companies, and most of the companies that I'm interested or I like to work in, they also need a person to help them run Agile ceremonies. And I thought that okay, this is the perfect time for me to go on a refresher ride with Vasco, one and only, on the topic. And here we are.
So what was the question that that started this episode and this conversation?
So this is how to run Agile ceremonies.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a question I get all the time. Many people, of course, mostly either managers who need to manage teams or Scrum Masters who are just starting their journey, they ask this question. But I wanted to really explore this a little bit further and actually go into the Scrum Guide. So as many of you know, that's written by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, which are two of the original creator of something they called patterns that then together form Scrum. So actually, we're going to talk about the Scrum Guide that describes the Scrum patterns. They call it the rules of the game. And actually, that's what it is. It's the rules for running a Scrum delivery method or delivery process. Of course, I'll add my own commentary to that, but so that you guys know, I'll put a link on the show notes and in the description below. The Scrum Guide is where, if you will, this is the authoritative source for what Scrum is. Now, the first question that Ed asked is, okay, so how do I run the Scrum and Agile ceremony? So let's dive into that a little bit. and start with the Scrum Guide, which I have right here. Hope you're seeing this on the screen. If you're not, the screen recording is on the YouTube channel. You can go there and, of course, follow it. And it starts with, the Scrum Guide has many things. It's about 13 pages, which I think is a pretty good size for the definition of Scrum. And it talks about two things which we are going to explore. So the first one is the Scrum events. So first note, they're not called Scrum meetings. They're also not called Scrum ceremonies, although there are other authors who refer to them as ceremonies. They are called Scrum events. And there's 5 here, as you can see, they're listed. The sprint, which is actually not an event, it's a container for the events. And then the sprint planning, daily scrum, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. We'll go through those. But as you can see, there's 2 key things here. First, the sprint. And we'll talk more about that. The sprint is one important concept in the Scrum, and it's a time box, meaning it starts and it ends at a pre-specified time. And then the Scrum artifacts, because the events happen to include and revolve around the artifacts, which are the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment. We'll talk about those first. We'll talk about those later, but first, the Scrum event. So first thing is the sprint is a container for all other events. So the first thing we learned by looking at the Scrum Guide is that the sprint is not an event, but it's a container. Everything happens within the sprint. And this is a very key insight to understand Scrum. It's all about what happens in one time box. It's not about how to run your company. It's not about how to run a multi-team project where some teams are not running Scrum. It is about how to run one team or a group of teams, if you take scaled Scrum approaches, that are working themselves on delivering increments, right? So if you have, let's say, a marketing team somewhere that is working in a different way, they're probably not using sprints or Scrum, but the team that is developing the software is most likely using sprint or Scrum. And the sprint is the container. Everything happens in a sprint. There's nothing happening outside the sprint. And this is an important concept. How we're doing so far, Ed?
Yeah, I love it. I think this is a fresh way to look at it. I never looked at it as a container, so it does help.
Absolutely. All right. So each event, and this is important, it's written as the second phrase in the description of Scrum events. Each event in Scrum is a formal, meaning there are other ways, but these are formal opportunities to inspect and adapt. Now, the Scrum Guide says inspect and adapt Scrum artifacts. I would say that is a failure of the authors. It's inspect and adapt, period. There's no need to add adapt Scrum artifacts. Of course, we're going to do that, but that's not the core. The core is to inspect and adapt. And inspection and adaptation is not in any way limited to the artifact. So that's a very important commentary from my side. I think the authors clearly failed by adding these last 3 words. Ed, you had a question.
So what is artifacts?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that in a second, but let me tell you what the artifacts are, just so that people know. The artifacts are the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment. And we'll talk more about what that means in a second. All right, so this is an important thing. It's not adapt Scrum artifacts, although that's true. It's adapt, inspect, and adapt, period. So the failure to operate any events as prescribed results in lost opportunities to inspect and adapt. And here you can see that they've taken the artifacts away, because it's not about artifacts. It's about us as a team working together to learn. And this is a key part, learn to play the game better. And I want to emphasize this play the game better, because actually what we're talking about, Scrum was inspired by a very old article called The New Product Development Game by Takeuchi and Nonaka, and they called it the game. Literally, that's what they called it. And that's where they used the first Scrum metaphor. In fact, the authors, Takeuchi and Nonaka, actually likened the efforts that a product development team does to a Scrum team trying to move the ball up the field. And that's where Scrum, the name, comes from, right? Then Jeff and Ken and Mike and others called this particular method the Scrum method, or the Scrum framework as they call it. But the idea is that it really is like a team trying to learn to play the game better. That's what you need to think about. When you think about Scrum, each sprint is like a game, right? It starts and it ends. It has very clear boundaries, and boundaries are extremely important in terms of self-improvement. And we learn to play the game better. That's what the sprint is all about, right? It's one game. We learn, we play, we inspect and adapt. We learn, we play it again. We inspect and adapt. We learn, we play it again. So that's a very important aspect.
Yeah, the term game here, I think the term Scrum here came from rugby, if I'm not wrong. Is it correct?
Yeah, correct. It comes from rugby. And Scrum is when all the players get together and they are trying to set up a move, right? They are all together. One of the teams has the ball and they have to set up a move, right? That image is the Scrum. And of course, that's what product development teams do, right? They come together and they set up the next move, right? So it came from there, but actually the new product development game paper was the first one to refer to product development as rugby. And that's where the Scrum word comes from.
Right.
All right. So now we know what the Scrum events are and what the sprint is. So sprint is a container, and each event is an opportunity to inspect and adapt. And take the artifacts away, please. Then we have sprint planning. This is the first event we're going to cover. Sprint planning is what starts the sprint, and it starts it by laying out the work to be performed. And it's almost, this is really like a rugby team. They get together in the Scrum and they agree on what the play is, right? And then they set it up. That's what they do. And that's what we do in product development. In sprint planning, we get the whole team together. We talk about where we need to move the ball next, and we set it up. We lay out the work that needs to be performed for the sprint. It goes a bit further than that. I'll go into that in a little bit. So key roles. Product owner, right? Sprint planning, the product owner needs to be there. Product owner is a role that embodies the idea of driving the product forward. They have the vision, they have the direction, they help the team figure out and clarify what that direction is. And of course, in sprint planning, they also tell the team, this is what I expect. Do you understand it? How can we achieve it? They tackle any dependencies they might have, any obstacles together with the team. And then they select the work, so the product backlog items. They select the work they're going to take into the sprint. That's what the sprint planning does. An important addition in this year's Scrum Guide, this is 2020 Scrum Guide, the Scrum team may also invite other people to attend sprint planning to provide advice. This is very important because some Scrum Masters tend to think that sprint planning is something that happens only with the team and the product owner. Well, that's not true. We bring in as many and the right people in order to help the team lay out the work to be performed for the sprint. And of course, we know that what we need to achieve. And that's actually done using something they don't call an artifact here. They call a commitment, I believe, which is the sprint goal, right? We're going to do this sprint, right? So this sprint, our goal is to allow people to register through their mobile phone. And then whatever items we take into the sprint backlog, they have to allow people to register through the mobile phone, right? So that's an example of what a sprint goal could look like. All right, questions about sprint planning, Ed?
No, I think I'm fine with this.
All right, cool. So next we go into the Daily Scrum. So Daily Scrum, as you can see, is the only event that doesn't have sprint in it because it happens daily. Right? It has daily in it. So that's a very important aspect. Now, there are some people that say, maybe we could run the Daily Scrum every other day, like 3 times a week or 2 times a week. Well, you're missing the whole point. The Daily Scrum is a pattern. Think back to a moment when something urgent was happening, a crisis. What happens? People get together and they talk about the problem every day. It's a pattern that emerges. So if that works in emergency situations, it definitely works every day. So Daily Scrum is to inspect progress towards the sprint goal, inspect and adapt. And so they say adapt the sprint backlog as necessary. We don't just adapt the sprint backlog. We might do a quick change of, who's on what position, right? We might say, hey, Ed, for today, we actually don't need you to create the Facebook campaign. We actually need you to work with a designer to generate the graphics we need for the book launch, which is not Facebook campaign, but the book launch is coming up and the designer is lost, and we need somebody to sit with the designer to get that done, right? That would be an adaptation. This is no change to the sprint backlog. It's just a change to who does what, right? So I think here the authors again missed the opportunity to talk about inspecting and adapting as a holistic understanding of how to reach our goal, which is, of course, the sprint goal. They do talk about adjusting the upcoming planned work. I think that this is probably the idea that, there's a plan for the sprint. Advanced teams don't use that kind of plans. They don't, set everything up in detail up front. So there's something that maybe this is important for beginner teams. But the key thing here is inspect the progress towards the sprint goal and adapt everything. Adapt everything. Who does what? Technologies. Do we escalate? Do we call somebody in? Adapt everything in order to reach that sprint goal. So sprint goal is like the definition of success for the sprint, right? It's the goal, right? If we're talking about football, you have to score a goal. Or for American friends, that's soccer, right? You have to score the goal. And every single day we work to score. That's what the Daily Scrum is about. And that's what we should be asking. What's preventing us from scoring, right? From reaching the sprint goal? That's the key question. And adapt anything you need to. So then the Daily Scrum is a 15-minute event. Again, this is part of the pattern, right? We've all been in meetings that, they just go on forever and they never end. That's not what the Daily Scrum is about. It's about getting together, huddling up, deciding what to do, and moving on. That's what the key is here. And
a question there.
Yeah, sure.
Why it says developers of the Scrum team?
Yeah, I think so. That's a very good question, Ed. So the Scrum Guide says the Daily Scrum is a 15-minute event for the developers of the Scrum team. I don't agree with that. I think this is totally wrong. The 15-minute event is for whoever is necessary. Now, most of the time, it will be the designers, the developers, the testers that are working together every day, right? But I would never have a Daily Scrum without the product owner. Right? The product owner is constantly gathering feedback from customer stakeholders, and they should bring that feedback into the Daily Scrum.
Yeah.
So I would say the Daily Scrum is a 15-minute event to help the team reach the sprint goal, period. And now it can mean anything. It can mean that it's only the developers. It can mean that it's the developers and the product owner. It can mean anything. Now, the authors do say that if the product owner or Scrum Master are actively working on items in the sprint backlog, they participate as developers. And I think this is a big failure from the part of the authors. The product owner and Scrum Master are always part of the team, even if they are not working on items in the sprint backlog. So I would just remove this last part here and say that it's for the Scrum team. And the Scrum team is composed of what they call developers in the Scrum Guide. So that's testers, designers, coders, programmers, but also the product owner and the Scrum Master. They are part of the team.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And this resonates very well with my experience in my last role as a senior product manager. To me, it makes no sense to just get developers on the team where they're not the only ones who are making the product.
Absolutely. So daily scrums are there to improve communication, identify impediments. This is, for me, the most important. Promote quick decision-making and consequently eliminate the need for other meetings. Now, I've worked with clients where they say, we have too many meetings. Could we stop the daily scrum? And I'm like, the reason why you have too many meetings is because you're not having the daily scrum. Ideally, and this is not always possible, especially in functional organizations where the teams are split up, but in cross-functional organizations where all the roles are in one team, the daily Scrum is all you need. And if you're all in the same room, like this year is 2020, it's a Corona year, nobody's in the same room, right? But if you were in the same room, you probably don't even need to have a formal 15-minute event. The Scrum Master just needs to make sure that the team is talking all the day. Every time a topic comes up, talking all the day to make sure that they are collaborating. Because the goal, the real reason for the daily Scrum is to amplify, to 10x the collaboration between the team members. And that they say that, in the Scrum Guide, the last part is, they can meet throughout the day. They don't need to meet only in the daily Scrum. For teams starting up, I would say always do the daily Scrum. Don't even argue with it. Just do it. Learn to do it well, and then move on. But always start with it. For teams that are already working very well, they might just skip the daily Scrum. They might have daily Scrum on their own messaging platform like Slack or WhatsApp, whatever. But the idea is that it's about communicating, it's about generating collaboration opportunities and taking advantage of those collaboration opportunities. Now, you see this in sports teams all the time. Like as the game goes on, they are talking to each other. They're constantly inspecting and adapting, changing positions slightly, giving advice to each other, explaining what their intention is so that they can play better the game. And it is quite a great metaphor for us as product development teams, because that's what we're doing, right? We're moving the ball forward towards the sprint goal. And in doing so, we need to constantly adjust our collaboration strategy.
Perfect.
Did you have more questions on the daily Scrum?
I don't have a question specific to daily Scrum, and I'm going to hold this question that I have till the end if we can get more time. Yeah.
All right, cool. Then we have sprint review. Sprint review, I like to call it demo because in my opinion, it is a review. So the name is correct, but I like to emphasize the aspect that we are demonstrating what we have delivered. So I like to call it the sprint demo. Some people call it demo and review. In the guide, they call it sprint review. The purpose of the sprint review is to inspect the outcome deliverable of the sprint and determine future adaptations. During the event, the Scrum team and stakeholders, this is important. Who are your stakeholders? Do you know who they are? Anyone that is can directly or indirectly affect product decisions should be included in the review. So the Scrum team and the stakeholders review what was accomplished in the sprint and what has changed in their environment. Because, as you develop more, you learn more, and that might mean that you need to change certain things. So this is a very important aspect. And again, highlights the idea of inspecting and adapting. Inspecting and adapting is the kernel of Scrum. And people need to understand this, that if you're not inspecting and adapting, if you're just quote unquote doing the work, you're not doing Scrum, even if you're hosting those events. Inspect and adapt. That's a key here. So the sprint review is the second to last event of the sprint, and it is time boxed to a maximum of 4 hours for a 1 month sprint. For shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. I usually have my sprint reviews at about 1 hour or less, and I try to set them up, facilitate them so that we can quickly go through the demo and then jump into conversation. And this is very important because you show what you have done, you allow the stakeholders to play with the product and give you their feedback, but then you need to be deliberate about learning from that, right? So demonstrating the product is a learning, it's an introspective, retrospective opportunity, but we need to do something with it. And that's why I try to set up the review so that we demonstrate the product and then we quickly go into reflection and improvement mode.
Does it happen on the last day of the sprint or after the sprint?
That's a very good question. So if you're going to schedule them, you schedule them the last day of the sprint. Obviously, don't make it a Friday afternoon because that's stupid because people just want to go home. If you're going to do it on a Friday, do it on a Friday morning. because then people still have a bunch of hours and they're not in a hurry to get out of the sprint review. I typically would like to start my sprints in the middle of the week because that helps to break off the inevitable rush and perhaps hastiness when it happens on a Friday. But I mean, you can also do it so that you start the sprint on a Friday and you end it on a Thursday. And that helps also because we're not in a hurry on a Thursday. And on a Friday, we kind of set the stage for the next sprint. And then people have a relaxing 2 days and then they come back re-energized. But, you need to find what works for your team. All teams are different. But if I'm going to schedule it, I would schedule it at the end, the last day of the sprint at the start of the day. And I would emphasize the need to do many micro reviews and demos throughout the sprint, right? You don't want to wait to the end of the sprint to find out that something you did was wrong. So I try to generate as many opportunities as possible to at least have the team and the product owner together review what they've delivered so that they can inspect and adapt, again, the core of Scrum, much more often.
Right.
All right. And next is the last event on the list. It's the sprint retrospective. And this is the event that if I would have to say one that must always happen, this is the one, right? If you just have, here's the thing. If you just have a time box, that's the sprint, the container, nothing else. If you just have a time box and a retrospective at the end of that time box, you can't avoid developing Scrum as a whole set of patterns because you're learning, right? That's the purpose of the sprint retrospective, is to learn how we improve the way we play the game. Now, the way the authors phrased it is that the purpose of the retrospective is to plan ways to increase quality and effectiveness. That's true, but it's not even nearly enough. It's not even 5% of what we need to do, right? So here's the thing. Scrum is there to improve your business. Increased quality and effectiveness are important. Some say maybe critical, but they're not enough. We might need to change strategy. That should be in the retrospective. We might need to change the team setup. That should be in the retrospective. We might need to change even the business area we are working on. That should be in the retrospective. So the Scrum Guide looks at product development teams as purely product development teams. I look at Scrum as a business growth process. And from that perspective, it's not about the product only. It's about everything else. And for me, the retrospective is very important in helping the team get out of their little corner, which they are in the whole sprint, because they're focused, right? The whole sprint, they're focused on their little corner, which is deliver an increment of the product. But that's not what we're doing. The game is not deliver the next increment. The game is improve the business with the next increment. All right, so the Scrum team inspects how the last sprint went with regards to individuals, interactions, processes, tools, and their definition of done. Definition of done is the first time we're talking about it. This is very important. Definition of done is what we say we are committing to as the minimum quality level. And this is important. Definition of done is the minimum quality level. It's not the maximum. It's the minimum quality level. In other words, it's the bar. It's what says if our delivery is ready to be considered done, or if there's still work to do, which then needs to be translated potentially into new sprint backlog items that go on to the next sprint. So the sprint retrospective concludes the sprint. It is time boxed to a maximum of 3 hours for a 1 month sprint. For shorter sprints, the event is usually shorter. We have a retrospective masterclass on the Scrum Master Toolbox Podcast website. The key thing, though, is that the sprint retrospective is definitely done at the end of the sprint. I would keep it there. I would not make it 3 hours even for a 1 month sprint. I would find opportunities to run micro retrospectives, regularly, like every day, whatever that is. Like just ask a question. Hey, guys, how did you guys think that meeting with Team Shark went yesterday? That's a retrospective moment. So for me, the role of the Scrum Master is to enable these retrospective moments throughout the sprint. Still having the retrospective at the end, but definitely not waiting to the end, especially in a 1 month sprint. It's still mind-boggling to me why we still have the 1 month sprint as the standard for Scrum. It's totally out of date. I think many of the teams are now in 2-week sprints. Certainly many of the teams I work with are in 2-week sprints, and I always advise, especially the more mature teams, to go to shorter sprints, right? 1 week as an example. All right, so those were the events. That's the question you asked first, right? How do we run the Scrum and Agile meetings? But I'm sure you have other questions about how to run those meetings.
Yeah, so a couple of them. The first one, when you were explaining the last part, was about what is the maximum duration a sprint could go for. So I know Basecamp, for example, works for 6-week long sprints. On a personal level, when I work on my project, sometimes 1 or 2 weeks I work on. But when deciding the length of, like, okay, this sprint has to be 2 weeks, is it more like a framework? Okay, we can do whatever we can in this given time. Or is it more like based on the project? Oh, this project would need 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. How does it work?
Yeah, so Basecamp is a terribly bad example because they are a very mature team and they got to where they are after doing many experiments. So I would say that never consider that as a great example for a team that is starting up. And in fact, I would say that teams that are learning need more quick feedback. They don't need less quick feedback. They need more quick feedback. Now, Basecamp has found ways to get that feedback much faster. Even every day, they're getting feedback. They're releasing new stuff every day. And if you follow their blog, you see that they are much faster than releasing a new product increment every 6 weeks. But what they are doing is they're doing a lot of marketing buzz around the 6-week mark. And that's okay. You can do that. But the team developing the product cannot work on 6-week cycles. That would be stupid, right? That's why many teams do daily deliveries to production to learn, to get feedback. They do beta cycles so that they can go through the delivery and customer feedback much faster than they do the final release to production, or to beta is also production, but to the final market. So I would say, if I would give an advice to any team getting started, I would say start with 2 weeks. And where do you find pain? Ask, what's making this painful? And instead of avoiding the pain, ask yourselves, how could we do more of this so that we cannot help but improve, right? When daily scrums are painful, people typically reduce the frequency of the daily scrums. They go to 2 times a week or 3 times a week. That's for me the opposite of what we should do. If the daily scrum is painful, it's for a reason. So figure out why and improve that. And maybe you need to do 2 daily scrums a day so that you start to learn, to understand what's missing here in order for us to benefit from what should be a collaboration enhancement event in the whole Scrum setup.
What's the difference between a design sprint and a Scrum sprint?
Very good point. Design sprints are a result of us not having small enough teams and having different departments working with different mindsets. Design sprint, as Google defines it, is a different thing. Design sprint, as Google defines it, is about the whole team working to get something out very, very quickly, but without committing to that as being the final version of the product, right? It's about learning something very quick. But very often what I hear when people say design sprint, they also say requirements sprint, they say planning sprint, some people call it sprint 0. This is like me starting a baseball game and then saying, nah, I think 4 bases are too little. Let's make this more exciting. Let's play with 5 bases. No, we don't really need that many outfield players. Why don't we just have 1 outfield player that runs all around and tries to catch the ball when the ball goes to the outfield? Like that, we tried Scrum, but we didn't really like it. That's a blog post by Michael Feathers, by Ron Jeffries, that actually illustrates how ridiculous it is to use Scrum and then not do Scrum, right? We'll use all the Scrum words, but we're not actually playing Scrum. Like, that's ridiculous. You can't get better.
Like the 3D chess.
Yeah.
It's like 3D chess, like 3 levels of chessboard, but it's not chess anymore, but we call it chess.
So I would say, let's focus on first following the rules, then learning what works and amplifying that, learning what doesn't work and working around that, constantly getting better.
Okay. So can scrums exist without sprints?
No. If you don't have a sprint, it's not Scrum anymore. One of the core aspects of Scrum is that it is a collection of patterns that worked well in the real world. Some teams benefited from those patterns, then some people collected a minimum list of patterns, put it together in the form of Scrum. So if you're not having sprints, it's not Scrum. It's something else. It might still be good for you. It's just not Scrum.
So if the companies choose to incorporate these rituals, meetings in their regular, just the way they are, they may be making use of those meetings. They may be making benefit out of those, but they're not Scrum at all.
Yeah, you can improve in many ways, right? But having a daily Scrum when you're not having sprints, time boxes, retrospectives, you don't have a product owner, you don't have a product backlog, that's not Scrum. I mean, you could call that a daily meeting, of course. You could even call it daily Scrum. It's just not a Scrum.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I think we can move on.
All right. So I'm just going to do a quick review of the Scrum artifacts. I think this is important. It's not too big, so I'm just going to go quickly through this. They say Scrum artifacts represent work or value. This is true, although I would try to focus on value. The product backlog, each artifact contains a commitment. For the product backlog, it's the product goal. So the product goal is what the team commits to try to achieve. The sprint backlog is the sprint goal. So every sprint, we try to achieve the sprint goal through the execution of the items in the sprint backlog. And then for the increment, which is a delivery, right? An increment is an incremental delivery of the product we are creating. The commitment is the definition of done. As I said before, that's the minimum quality bar that we commit to adhere to before we say the work is done. So the product backlog is emergent, so it grows and evolves all the time, but also an ordered list. This is very important. Ordered list. Priority is critical in a product backlog because otherwise we start too many things and we don't finish enough, right? So this is a very important, emergent and ordered. But this is the most important for me. For a Scrum team, the single source of work is the product backlog. In other words, if it's not on the backlog, it's not going to get done. CEO calls you in the middle of the night and asks you, hey, could you do that for me for tomorrow? You go back to the CEO and says, absolutely. Just talk to the product owner, make sure it's in the product backlog, and we can take it up in the next sprint, right? So product backlog is a key aspect that also defines the contracts with stakeholders, right? What do we promise to do? We promise to work on the product backlog. We also promise not to do anything else so that we don't get distracted. We don't get, turned away from the priorities, the ordered list that the product owner has defined. Right? And you can imagine how chaotic it would be if everyone on the team would just take work from anywhere else, like, important people and important stakeholders, but they would just take work from anywhere else. And then the team members would go like, hey, wait a minute, Ed, we agreed we would create the Facebook campaign today. Why aren't you working on it? And then you say, well, it's because I decided. Wait a minute, you decided? Who's the product owner? See, so it's very important to follow the product backlog. All right. There's an aspect which is not yet in the Scrum Guide, but I do that with my teams. A product backlog includes items, that's a product backlog items, that can be done by the Scrum team within one sprint. And here's the key. They are deemed ready to go into the sprint before they get into the sprint. So this ready part is very important. We call it the definition of ready. It emerged because many items were getting into sprint planning, but they were not ready. They were unclear. They were too fuzzy. There was no clear definition of acceptance criteria. And that's a bad thing because the team gets lost and they lose time trying to figure that out during the sprint. So many teams that I work with have what they call a definition of ready, or DOR, that each product backlog item needs to meet before it gets accepted into the sprint. The commitment for the product backlog is the product goal. Then we have the sprint backlog, and the sprint backlog has two parts. It's the sprint goal and the product backlog items that the team has defined they will work on. Now, the author says an actionable plan for delivering the increment. That's not part of the sprint backlog. That's just how we agree to go about delivering the what. So I'd say that this is not part of your sprint backlog, but it is an agreement you make during the sprint planning. So sprint backlog should have the why and the what. So the sprint goal, why it's important, and the what are the items. Sprint goal for me is the most important aspect of sprint planning. I always start sprint planning with the sprint goal. And if we run out of time, I would rather have the sprint goal than the list of backlog items we are going to take, because I trust the team and the product owner will work together to decide which items make sense to reach that goal. So I would focus on the why first. And then finally, we have the increment. An increment is a concrete stepping stone toward the product goal. That's how they defined it. Basically, it's a new version of the product or a new feature added to the product, whatever that is. It's an increment of value added to the product that gets us closer to the sprint goal. And they add something here that I think is very important. The sprint review should never be considered a gate. So Scrum teams are encouraged to release every day, to deliver product increments every day. So the sprint review is about learning, inspecting, and adapting. It's not about creating a gate for releasing. If you need a gate, that's a different problem. Handle it somewhere else. Don't wait until the end of the sprint. If you have something ready mid-sprint, you should deliver that, right? So that's a very important aspect. And work cannot be considered part of an increment unless it meets the definition of done. And this is very important. That's the commitment of the increment. We've already talked about it. They say, and maybe this is the last thing I want to highlight here, the definition of done creates transparency by providing everyone a shared understanding of what work was completed about as part of the increment. This transparency means that if something was done, quote unquote, but did not meet the definition of done, it's considered in progress. It is not moved to the done column. I've done everything I can. Great. But there are other people who need to contribute. So this item isn't done, right? So that's a very important aspect. Right. So that was my last comment on the Scrum and Agile meetings. But you had other questions. Perhaps I want to just go through this question here.
Before that.
Okay, sure.
What happens if a Scrum is finished and the goal is not met? Does it goes to another Scrum, or you just rush on to finish it off and then start another Scrum?
Yeah, that's a very good question. If the sprint goal is not met, we need to learn why. So you do the review, you are clear and transparent towards the stakeholders. We did not reach this goal, but maybe you reached other goals that were not even described first. But we didn't reach this goal, we need to learn from it. Then in the retrospective, you analyze that, you make changes to the way you work so that next sprint you're more likely to reach the sprint goal. And then you start a new sprint from scratch. The way I usually phrase it is, everything needs to earn the right to be on the sprint backlog in the sprint planning event. Everything. We don't work on stuff just because we failed to deliver it last sprint, so we kind of carry it over, right? That we call that spillage. And that's not really a good thing. So we need to learn, why did that happen? How can we make it better? Now, in most cases, it's probably small things that need to be finished. You finish it in the next sprint, and that's okay. But in some cases, it might be that it's just the wrong thing to do, to take on that item and move it to the next sprint. We might want to drop it completely because we learned something significant that changes the priorities. So we don't want to work on that. So everything, in my mind, needs to earn its right to go on to the next sprint during the sprint planning event.
So sprint planning, does it happen before the sprint start or at the beginning of the sprint?
So that's an important question. Some tools need you to answer that question. But we people don't need to answer that question. You can have sprint planning the day before the sprint starts. You can have sprint planning the day when the sprint starts. you can have a 1 hour break between the last retrospective and the next sprint planning. You can have a half a day break between the last retrospective and the next sprint planning. It doesn't really matter, but it is the beginning of the commitment. So it's only after sprint planning that we actually are committing to what we want to do.
What if it takes too much time? I mean, the sprint started and you do it after the sprint started and you found out that one day is gone and you're still in the planning phase.
Yeah, and that happens. And teams do go through that. That's an anti-pattern, right? That's a bad thing, because what are you going to do if the sprint started and there's no sprint plan, there's no sprint goal and no selected backlog items? Like, what are you going to do? You're going to work on random stuff? Right? So some teams do have what they call learning or improvement time. I know that SAFe has a whole sprint for that, which is more like a buffer. But if you're going to do that, like if you're going to give time to the team to do stuff they want to work on without any, concern of does it, meet the sprint goal or not, then just give them that time explicitly and say that we have a break between the end of the previous sprint and the beginning of the next. And you can do whatever you think is necessary in that break, right? It could be half a day or even a day. It doesn't matter. But the sprint only starts when we have a clear sprint goal, and that's defined in the sprint planning.
Cool.
All right. Then final question is, how is Agile different from Scrum? This is a very important question. Many people ask this question. Let me just say that Scrum is a framework. I would call it a method, but some people call it a framework and the creators call it a framework. Okay, so Scrum is a framework that fits the Agile values and principles. Agile is, if you will, the philosophy behind the creation of methods like Scrum, like extreme programming, like feature-driven development. That was one of the old Agile methods. Agile was kind of a collective name for what we called at that time lightweight methodologies, as opposed to the waterfall heavyweight methodologies, right? So in that context, Scrum is just a lightweight methodology. So that means Scrum is an Agile methodology, but Agile is the philosophy behind, right? And Scrum is kind of an instantiation, an example of what it would look like to create an Agile method.
Can you think of any alternative of Scrum, like which is the competitor of Scrum or a challenger of Scrum, a method?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the Agile community, clearly Kanban is the most used alternative. Kanban is quite different in that it does not have time boxes. So it uses a different perspective, a different paradigm in order to manage the work. But it also has teams, it also has reflection, it also has demos and reviews. It's also about inspecting and adapting. So there's a lot of the things that are in Scrum, but it's a different method. But for me, my favorite is extreme programming. Extreme programming was one of the initial lightweight methodologies, and it started from the software world, but it has many of the practices that many Scrum teams will need to apply as they learn to play the game better. Those practices are already defined in extreme programming. So a couple of examples: test-driven development, or the creation of unit tests to validate that our software keeps on working as we wanted it to. There's also customer in the room, meaning that in Scrum calls it the product owner, but it's somebody who knows what the product should look like and gives us constant feedback so that we may improve all the time. Like, there's many practices that Scrum teams will eventually adopt that actually were defined in extreme programming, explained by Kent Beck.
Yeah, cool. I got the idea. One last question. There was something that you were mentioning in the first part of our discussion today. And I think that it's very, very important, and especially for someone like me, who's not having extensive experience of going through many, many, many teams as an insider. So that is the difference between functional and cross-functional. I would love for you to go a little bit detail on the differences on functional and cross-functional teams.
Yeah, that's a very important point. So functional is like this. It's waterfall, period. Think about it this way. If you divide your teams into the design team, the programming team, the testing team, and they work separately, then necessarily you will have to first create the design. When that is ready, you give it over to the programmers who then create the product. And then you give it over to the testers who then test the product. And that's what the waterfall looks like, right? So that's what functional is. Now, cross-functional means that instead of having all the designers in one team, all the programmers in one team, and all the testers in one team, you have teams that comprise those three roles, and then you work together all the time, incrementing the product as you go, like Scrum describes. And there's no need to hand over. This is a very important word, hand over something to the other, right? Because we know that when the developer and the tester and the designer work well together, like work every day together, they find problems much faster, they resolve problems much faster, and the quality is overall higher. So that's what a cross-functional team would look like. And there's a spectrum, right? There's not, fully cross-functional, fully functional. So, for example, you might have designers, testers, and programmers in one team, and then you might have finance and marketing in another team. That's both cross-functional at the creation of the product level, but also it is functional in the sense that some parts of the delivery chain, like marketing and sales, are outside the team, right? So very simply, the harder the challenge, the more towards the cross-functional side of the spectrum you should go. The easier the challenge, the more you can, although I don't think you should, but the more you can be on the functional side. So you can afford the inefficiencies of a functional organization when the problem you need to solve is very simple. But when the problem you need to solve is very complex, you cannot afford the inefficiencies of a functional organization. So you need to move closer to the cross-functional organization.
Cool. Yeah, clear.
All right. So I hope this was useful to you, Ed, and also to our listeners. This was just a short review of what the Scrum Guide says about those questions. So thank you very much for asking the questions, Ed, though. This was brilliant.
Awesome. I definitely enjoyed it. It was amazing refresher and thinking of it from your perspective. I've read the books. I've done some, like in my previous role, some of it, because we haven't been religiously sticking with the process, but it's bringing in the whole picture together very well here.
Right. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.